This video covers 2.1 to 2.2 for Math 7. So we will be talking about changing rational numbers to decimals and decimals back to rational numbers. We will also be comparing rational numbers, ordering rational numbers from least to greatest, as well as adding rational numbers. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And our first section that we're going to talk about is changing our rational numbers to decimals. So here, we want to take these rational numbers and change them into decimal form. So when we're given a number like -2 and 5/8, since we have a whole number here, we're not really going to mess with that. -2 is always going to be -2. Now what we're going to focus on is the fraction part, the 5/8. That's going to be what we turn into a decimal. So in order to do that, since we can't make our denominator an easy 100, we're just going to divide. The top number goes inside our division house. Our denominator goes on the outside. So 8 can't go into 5, so we add a decimal, bring that straight up, and add a 0. So 8 can go into 50. We just need to decide how many times can that go into 50. And that is 6 times. 6 times 8 is 48. We have 2 left over. In order to continue this long division, we're going to add a 0, bring it down. 8 can go into 20, 2 times. 16, 4 left over. Again, bring down a 0. And 8 can go into 40 5 times. And we have nothing left over. So I'm going to go ahead and move this -2. So we've changed our 5/8 into a decimal. Our -2 stays the same, so changing this rational number into a decimal is -2 and 625 thousandths. We're going to do the exact same thing for our second one, 7/11ths. There is no negative sign, so our answer is going to be positive. There's no whole number, so we know our answer is less than 1, so I'm going to put a 0 and a decimal there. Our 7 goes on the inside. Raise this up a little bit. 11 on the outside. Add a decimal, bring it up, add a 0. 11 can go into 70 6 times, and we get 66. Bring down our 4. And we're going to do this until we end up with either a repeating decimal or our decimal ends. So 11 can go into 40 3 times. That is 33. We left with 7. Bring this down. And we start to see a pattern. So here it's actually 63 hundredths, and it is repeating. So it keeps going. So that's 63 hundredths. Both the 6 and the 3 repeat. So we're going to add that bar right above our 63 because that is what repeats. So it's 63 hundredths repeating. So that's how we change our rational numbers into decimals. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to decimals to rational numbers. So here, basically the way you say your decimal is the way you write it. So you really have to be aware of your decimal place values. So we want to take first one here, -3 and 1/10, and we're going to change that into a rational number, so a fraction. So that -3 is still -3, and now we look at our decimal place. That's 1/10, so we write it as 1/10. What we have to look at next is, can we simplify that fraction? Here we cannot, so -3 and then 1/10 is our final answer. Same thing for our second one, -12 and 75 hundredths. The -12 is left alone. Here, 75 hundredths, so 75 over 100. That can be simplified though, so we are actually going to divide both of these by 25, and we are left with -12 and 3/4. So that's just changing decimals to rational numbers back to decimals. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to comparing. So here you're given both fractions and decimals. In order to compare those, we really need them in the same form of number, so either both rational numbers or both decimals. I tend to go towards decimals, so I'm going to do this the decimal way. I'm going to change my 7/8 into a decimal and compare it that way. So 8 can go into 70 7 times, or actually 8 times, excuse me, it'd be 8 times. And that's 64. We're left with 6. We continue on. Since both of our decimals are going to start with an 8, then we need to see what's going on here. 8 can go into 67 times. So we're left with 56. I'm going to go ahead and finish this one out. 8 can go into 45 times. So here, 7/8 is 875 thousandths, and we're comparing that to 854 thousandths. So here, 7/8 is larger, is greater than 854 thousandths. So that's our answer there. Again, we're going to do the same thing on our second problem. I'm going to take 16/11ths. I'm going to make that into a decimal. So 16 goes on the inside, 11 on the outside. 11 can actually go into 16, which shouldn't be surprising because 16/11ths is an improper fraction. So 11 can go into 16 one whole time. We're left with 5 as our remainder. So here, that's when we add our decimal, bring it up, add the 0, bring it down. 11 can go into 50 4 times. 44. Add another 0 so we can continue. 11 can go into 60 5 times. 55. We're left with 5. Here we start to see, again, another pattern. We already had 50 once, so it looks like this 45 is going to repeat. So 1 and 45 hundredths repeating is actually equal to our decimal version, 1 and 45 hundredths repeating. So we can do less than, greater than, or equal to when we're comparing. Our next step is going to be ordering our rational numbers. Here, again, you want your numbers in the same format. So I, again, tend to change all of these into decimals and then order them least to greatest. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video, attempt to order those rational numbers from least to greatest, and then check with me. I'm going to go ahead and change these all into decimals first on my first problem, and then I'll come back on and we can talk about ordering them from least to greatest. Okay, so I changed my two fractions into decimals above it. When we're ordering these, we want them in least to greatest order. So I'm actually going to start with my either positive or I'm going to start with 0 on my positive numbers. So 0 is going to be in the middle there. I've got two positive numbers, 3 and 25 hundredths, and 1 and 6 tenths repeating, so 5 thirds. 5 thirds is the next largest, and then we move on to 3 and 25 hundredths. So those are a little bit easier to order. When we're dealing with negative numbers, we want to make sure the number that's farthest away from 0 is our smallest number. So -2 and 5 tenths is actually a lot farther away from 0 than -2 thirds. So that's how we would order our two there. So this should be your final answer. Make sure they are in original form. We don't want to write them as the decimal version. We want to write them as what we were given them as, so like 5 thirds and -2 thirds. Again, go ahead and pause this video because I'm going to do the exact same thing I did on the second one, change all of my fractions into decimals. Then I'll go ahead and come back on here and we'll talk about ordering them from least to greatest. Okay, so I went on ahead and changed all of my fractions into decimals. So now I'm going to look at my two negative numbers and decide which one is farther away from 0. I've got -1 and 6 tenths and -4 thirds, which I changed into -1 and 3 tenths. So here, -1 and 6 tenths is the farthest away from 0. Then we've got -4 thirds. We've got those two taken care of. Now we're dealing with whole numbers. If we're looking at our first decimal place, either that 8, that 9, or that 6, 2 thirds would actually come next because 6 is the smallest, and we're talking about negative numbers, or positive numbers, excuse me. And then we've got 4/5 or 9 tenths. Here, 4/5 is the next largest, giving us 9 tenths as our largest number. And that's in order from least to greatest. So we're going to go ahead and move on to adding rational numbers. We're going to go ahead and start with decimals and we will end with fractions. So I've got two decimal problems here. The best way to approach these problems is first decide, do I have more negatives or do I have more positives? Since we see that they're different signs, I've got 4 and 53 hundredths negatives, 6 and 34 hundredths positives. So here I actually start with more positives so I can decide my answer is positive. Because I know my answer will be positive and our two numbers have different signs, now we need to find the difference. So we've got 6 and 34 hundredths, and we're going to subtract 4 and 53 hundredths. We're going to do regular subtraction with our decimals. So 4 minus 3 gives us 1. You have to borrow for this one. Bring down your decimal, and we're left with 1 and 81/100. And because we know that that's a positive number, that is our final answer. Our second one looks a little bit different. We've got that minus a negative, so that actually cancels each other out. That turns into a positive. Don't forget those rules. So now I've got -7 and 91/100 plus 5 and 28/100. So I'm going to just rewrite that underneath so I don't get confused. And I see that I've actually got more negatives here. So my answer is going to be a negative number. And again, since my two numbers are different signs, I'm going to find the difference. So the larger value, 7 and 91/100, I'm going to subtract 5 and 28/100 from that. And then we apply our negative sign and we should have our final answer. So we have to borrow here. Bring down your decimal. And we've got 2 and 63/100. Again, we know that this is a negative number. So -2 and 63/100 should be our final answer. So the last thing that we have to cover is adding rational numbers that are in fraction form. So we have to think about when we're adding fractions, same rule apply when they're positive, we need to have that common denominator. So when I look at -7/5 plus 13/15, and I look at 5 and 15, I'm going to actually keep the common denominator as 15. So I'm only really changing one of my fractions. So I have to multiply my first fraction by 3, numerator and denominator. So I've got -21/15. And then I'm adding 13/15. So once I have that done, I look at my numerators because I'm adding my numerators here. -21 plus a positive 13. So we've got more negatives than positives, so that answer is going to be negative. Here it should be -8/15. -8/15 should be your answer here. Our second one is going to require a little bit more work. When we've got a mixed number, we have to change that into an improper fraction. So I'm going to have 13/4 plus -49/10. So that's changing that into an improper fraction. But then I want to get a common denominator, and I'm actually going to change this to 20. So I have to multiply 4 by 5. I'm going to do the same thing to my numerator on my first one. So 4 multiplied by 5 gave me that 20 there. 13 multiplied by 5 gives me 65. Then here we're going to multiply by 2. And we have to make sure we keep that negative. Don't forget that negative sign. And we've got -98/20. So since we've got the common denominator, now we're going to look at numerators. It's 65 plus -98. Again, since we have more negatives than we do positives, our answer is going to be negative. So here it ends up being -33/20, which can be simplified. 20 can go into 33 one whole time, but it is a negative number. And so when we take 20 away from 33, we're left with 13/20. So our answer is -1 and 13/20. So that covers all the topics that you guys will see on your quiz. Go ahead and rewatch any sections you need to. Make sure to review any other problems, maybe from graded homework. Study your notebook, and good luck.